Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is my immense pleasure to welcome Dr. Charles Asher Small to be speaking with us today. Charles is the founder and executive director of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, and he is the director of the Fellowship Training Program on Critical Anti-Semitism Studies at the Woolf Institute, University of Cambridge. Charles is also an academic visitor at St Antony's College, Oxford. He is a prominent scholar and public speaker, specializing in the fields of contemporary anti-Semitism, including the delegitimization of Israel and notions of Jewish peoplehood, social and cultural theory, globalization and national identity, social movements, political Islam, and racism. He is one of my intellectual inspirations and such a formidable force in the fight against anti-Semitism. The title of his talk today is The Establishment of Contemporary Critical Anti-Semitism Studies, an Interdisciplinary Approach. So please do join me in welcoming Charles virtually to the Woolf Institute in Cambridge to speak with us today.
Thank you very much, Chloe, for a kind introduction. Thank you. And I was wondering, Ira, are you able to open up the screen so we can see everybody other than just, like, I can only see the ISGAP people.
We are sending the invites to everybody at this time. Everyone in the attendees, you are welcome to accept the promotion to panelists and turn your cameras on. We'd love to make it as interactive as possible.
Well, thank you. So I'll give it a moment so I can see who's here, sort of. And I guess it'll be a slightly friendlier virtual COVID session. So I'll let everybody sign on and then I'll start in a moment. Great. So it's very nice to see some familiar faces. Thank you for joining us. It's great to see you. Stephen, hello. Barbara. A lot of Alan Stein. A lot of familiar faces. Nice to see everybody. Sort of. And Harriet, nice to see you. Thanks for joining in. Holly. All right, so I'm going to begin. So basically, first of all, I'm honored. Hello, Ellen. I'm honored to give the inaugural lecture in the seminar series that ISGAP is putting on with the Woolf Institute. It's a great honor that the Woolf Institute is working with ISGAP. We created a program, a postdoctoral program in critical anti-Semitism studies at the Woolf Institute in Cambridge. And we are also, just to let you know, during the summer, we're going to have a major international conference entitled Global Anti-Semitism, A Crisis of Modernity Revisited. It's the same themes we did 10 years ago at Yale. So 10 years on, we're going to have the conference, and we're also going to have the summer school. A few days after the Cambridge conference, we'll have the summer school in Oxford. And I see Miriam is here. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for the privilege of working with ISGAP at the Woolf Institute. So thank you for being here. So today I'm going to speak about the urgent need to create critical anti-Semitism studies as a discipline in the academy. And in a sense, there's a blind spot, not only in academia and in policy, but in political discourse and in public discourse. And I think nothing could be more evident to those of us who are concerned about contemporary anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred and human rights and notions of sort of robust democratic notions of citizenship. When this British jihadist flew from Manchester, England, and went to Texas and went to a suburban synagogue in Texas on Shabbat, he was very clear on his mission. He was going to kill Jews and to attack Zionists and American imperialism. And he went to a synagogue. His ideology, his mission, his words spoke with a deep sense of clarity and conviction to his ideas. And yet the FBI, the BBC, and many other security forces and media outlets and intellectuals perceive this not as an anti-Semitic attack, not as a jihadist issue, but some random act carried out by somebody with psychological disabilities. And it took a few days for the BBC to clarify its mistake and also for the FBI to do the same. So the question is, some of us who are engaged in the study of anti-Semitism or who are concerned about anti-Semitism see these examples sometimes as an affront, or the BBC or some intellectuals are being soft on anti-Semitism, or don't want to deal with anti-Semitism, or only want to look at anti-Semitism on the left, or only anti-Semitism on the right. And there's sort of this kind of discourse that takes place among those of us who are concerned about the rise of contemporary anti-Semitism. But I would submit to you, more often than not, it's not a mean-spiritedness that is driving people to this, wrong conclusion on instances of contemporary anti-Semitism, but that there is a blind spot in scholarship and in policy when it comes to understanding the processes surrounding contemporary anti-Semitism. So unlike issues of race and racism and colonialism, unlike issues of gendered inequality and issues of sexism, and even more recently, this sort of dealing with issues of queer studies and homophobia in society, that in the last several decades, in the last 4 or 5 decades, there has been a very positive development in that in the 1960s and 70s, academia started addressing racial inequality and issues of racism, which was a blind spot. It took white professors at Yale University in the 1950s and 60s, historians, to be the first white scholars in a segregated American education system to start engaging issues of slavery and racism. Du Bois and other African-American intellectuals were doing it a long time before that, but they were subjugated in mostly traditionally Black, historically Black colleges and away from the mainstream of American education. So in the 1950s and 60s, there was a breakthrough. And since then, scholarship on issues of race, racism, social construction of identity has become an important part of academic endeavors and scholarship. And that's a good point. A decade or two later, with the Year of the Woman, 1973, the year of Why Not, my mother was a feminist leader in Montreal and in Canada during that year with the UN Women Year of the Woman. And the slogan was Why Not? There was steadily sort of a breakthrough in looking at sexism, gender inequality in the work environment, in the social environment, in the cultural environment. And academia finally started to engage a lot of the issues that deal with gendered inequality and issues of sexism. And I would submit on the road for racial equality or gendered equality, I think there's still a long way to go, but we have to, I think, look back and say that there has been some progress and some awareness of issues of racism and sexism in our society, in our language, in the urban landscape, in hiring practices, in access to goods and services by different sectors and demographics in our societies, and the notion of citizenship and how to make a robust citizenship, guaranteeing people access to goods and services and equality. So there has been progress. And I think more recently, in the last 10 to 20 years, there's been the slow emergence of queer studies, of looking at homophobia in society. And that has also been, I think, steps in the right directions. Clearly, there is homophobia, sexism, and racism. But I think if you go and sit around a dinner table, or if you go to an academic seminar at a good university anywhere in Europe and North America and South America, there is an awareness when it comes to racism, sexism, and homophobia. how it's reflected in our language and our discourse. And I think there's sort of a critical awareness by most people, particularly those with an education. And that is all for the good. And I think it's interesting, the sort of backlash against political correctness and wokeness. The wokeness, elements of the wokeness, I think should be, we should look at it critically, but hopefully this critique of wokeness won't erode some of the progress that's been made on issues of racial equality and gender equality and the fight against homophobia. So, I mean, that is also, I suspect, of concern in this environment. When it comes to anti-Semitism, however, as Robert Wistrich called the longest hatred, the hatred that is perhaps at the very core of Western thought and Western civilization, that the Jew was the quintessential other at different phases of Western history, and anti-Semitism is deeply embedded in Western society. So we understand how race and gender inequality is structured into language, into economic differentiation, access to goods and services and political processes, etc., and cultural processes. But if we look at the discourse of anti-Semitism in the academy, this sort of critical theory which exists in issues of race, gender equality, and queer studies is not applied to the issue of anti-Semitism, even though the legacy of anti-Semitism in Western society is deep, right? So we know, I've discussed this many times, I'll be brief, there's sort of three general phases of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitisms. When the dominant perspective of perceiving reality was through the lens of religion, the Jew was the quintessential other. The Jew was criticized for not accepting the Christian notion of the Messiah. They were perceived as stubborn. The Gospels and the church at various points in time, particularly in Europe and later during colonial times, perceived the Jew as being blinded by evil, by not accepting Christianity and the Christian notion of the Messiah, and that the Jew was condemned to not being able to have any sense of redemption. Now, what makes anti-Semitism inherently genocidal, and Robert Wistrich and David Nuremberg and other leading scholars in the field go into these issues in great detail, what makes anti-Semitism a unique form of hatred is that people were preaching and teaching that not only would the individual Jew be unable to have redemption by not accepting the Christian notion of the Messiah or Christianity, but that the stubborn Jew was holding back the world from redemption, that the Jew was guilty of hindering the world from having redemption unless they would accept the Christian notion of the Messiah and the religion. When the dominant perspective of perceiving reality shifts from religion to notions of race, ethnicity, biologically determined notions of racial or ethnic identities, the Jew was perceived as the race that was not only inferior, but was poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race. And unlike the period in the religious form of anti-Semitism, when the Jew could flee or convert to save their life, race in Western thought was perceived as something that was inherently fixed within people. You couldn't convert outside the designated notion of being, of the assigned racial identities. So in order to save the purity of the white Aryan race, the Jew had to be eliminated, and this sort of racist form of anti-Semitism culminates in the Holocaust, in the Shoah. So today, these forms, the racist and religious forms of anti-Semitism in liberal intellectual spaces like the university or the media of record is basically no longer tolerated. I think if anybody would espouse this type of religious or racist forms of anti-Semitisms, I think that they would be in serious social problem, would not be accepted. But today, the dominant way the dominant form of anti-Semitism or of the anti-Semitisms is an attack on who Jews are as a people, on Jewish peoplehood, on the connection that Jewish people have to their homeland, to Israel, and to Zionism. This is not only the basis for contemporary anti-Semitism. One would argue that, like in the past, this form of contemporary anti-Semitism is actually something that is not only accepted in academia or in the academic spaces or in the media of record, but it's something that is actually promoted and tolerated. That this anti-Semitism, this form of anti-Semitism, is alive and well. And that in a sense, we don't have, as a group of scholars, what we're trying to do with at ISGAP is to create critical anti-Semitism studies, is to create a comprehensive framework of analysis that goes deep into understanding contemporary anti-Semitism. I recently had a conversation with Professor Boaz Ganor at the IDC, and for years, we've been arguing that most scholars that look at anti-Semitism have traditionally been historians looking at Western forms of anti-Semitism. And those who look at issues of terror and security studies don't really pay attention to the issues of anti-Semitism. And the scholars of anti-Semitism don't really pay attention to the ideology that deals with issues of contemporary terror and security. And there has to be a sort of an interdisciplinary approach to understanding contemporary anti-Semitism that both fields of study need to be speaking to each other. A recent example of the manifestations, the intellectual manifestations of anti-Semitism could be seen with Professor Gopal at Cambridge. Professor Gopal is an eminent scholar, a professor of historian of post-colonial studies, a respected member of the Cambridge University landscape. And she's been tweeting out, sort of attacking Jewish intellectuals and Jewish journalists for supporting the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. She's been tweeting this out to her, she has about, I think, 800,000 followers, very popular public intellectual, and also calling Jewish men kind of white settlers in their approach to fighting anti-Semitism and attacking her ideas. So in a sense, what's remarkable, and this may be, unpleasant for those of us who are concerned about anti-Semitism, but I think if you look at the political discourse or the intellectual discourse at this moment, what Professor Gopal is expressing is actually rooted and accepted in scholarship, in academia, in this sort of philosophical postmodern moment, that she's actually standing on more solid ground than we are as we try to understand and unpack issues of contemporary anti-Semitism, that she has, in a sense, she's expressing and inherited the intellectual framework that has been laid down by decades of work, by postmodern thought, by post-colonial thought, by the works of Edward Said and Michel Foucault, and that sort of whole space of public intellectual discourse that is, if not dominant in academia, certainly a very strong political, cultural, intellectual framework that is prevalent in some of the best universities in the Western world. Whereas those of us who are doing scholarship on anti-Semitism, I think that we have been speaking among ourselves quite a bit and sort of taking a very descriptive historical assessment of anti-Semitism in the historical framework. So this is, in a sense, our challenge, in my view, and I think in the view of my colleagues at ISGAP, is our attempt to create a framework, a critical analytical framework that is interdisciplinary, that looks at processes, economic, social, and cultural processes that are permeating or taking place in society, in the age of globalization and looking at issues of power and power dynamics as it relates to anti-Semitism, and to move away from more the traditional descriptive assessment that most historical accounts of anti-Semitism, primarily the Holocaust and anti-Semitism in European society, has been documenting. That now we live in a globalized space, a globalized world, where on the one hand we have the sort of the intellectual anti-Semitism, to be crude, kind of the left-green alliance. The Islamists are opposed to Western hegemony and Western colonial and imperial legacy, and the postmodern, post-colonial are also, in a sense, opposed to Western hegemony from a different perspective, but there is a common interest. So there's sort of a red-green alliance. And then, of course, we have the emergence or the re-emergence of the radical right and white supremacy and xenophobia and the like. And the Jewish question is sort of, in the Jewish communities in the diaspora and Israel, is sort of very much in the center of the crosshairs of these sort of, I would say, quite radical social movements. And it's our challenge to understand, to sort of map and decode this very fluid moment in history, to understand what is causing it and why is sort of anti-Semitism reemerging at a level and in a force locally, nationally, and internationally. You know, what is causing this to take place? So, in a sense, the project of the postdoctoral program that Lev, Toper, and Chloe Pinto, our first postdocs, who are incredibly bright young scholars, hopefully they'll be the first of many scholars, is trying to work with them and other leading scholars who are concerned about anti-Semitism to kind of create a comprehensive interdisciplinary framework to understand contemporary anti-Semitism. So part of the work that we're doing now, for example, is we're tracing the perception of the Jew and of Zionism and of Israel in the academy, from sort of post-Holocaust studies to the contemporary context. So I'm gonna be very crude, but I'm gonna just, you know, explain in a nutshell what we find fascinating and troubling. So if you look at the Frankfurt School of Thought, the Frankfurt School of Thought was developed primarily by refugees from Germany and Europe after the Holocaust. Most of them were Jewish intellectuals and refugees, but not all of them. And the Frankfurt School created a very important perspective of understanding society, including issues of authoritarianism, of Nazism, of anti-Semitism, of the role of the Jew, of the authoritarian personality. So looking at things from an interdisciplinary perspective, philosophical, psychological, etc. And the Frankfurt School was a very important perspective in academic thinking for decades. And for the first time, really, in Western thought, really looked at anti-Semitism and Nazism and what happened in the Holocaust in a comprehensive framework. Very important. And then in the 1970s and 80s, Edward Said comes along in the sort of postmodern moment. Said, for example, was hanging out with Michel Foucault in Paris in the 1970s, and hanging out with, as an example of this, spending time with the Iranian revolutionary movers and shakers who were in exile from Iran living in France. And they both perceived the Iranian Revolution as something that would be akin to the French Revolution and Enlightenment for Europe. The Iranian Islamic Revolution would be the same for the Islamic world or for Muslims. And this was Said and Foucault. No attempt to look at the anti-Semitism in the regime's ideology, the perception of women in society, the role of gay people in society. So these contradictions, you know, their capacity for accepting the other, which is, key to a democratic, multicultural citizenship or society. So no exploration of these profound contradictions that we now, 35 years later, understand the implications of this on society. So Said and Foucault see this as something positive. Said goes on to say in the 1970s and later in the 1980s that he was the last Jewish intellectual. Think about it. Edward Said, who portrayed himself as Palestinian, although he was Egyptian from Cairo, his family had a summer home in Jerusalem, and he's Christian. He portrays himself as the last Jew, and that the Palestinians were the Jews. He goes on to say that the Jewish intellectuals are getting fat in suburban America, and he was the last remaining Jew. And that the Palestinians and those who were once colonized are the Jewish people. And of course, the Jews are the white supremacist apartheid Nazis. Right? So he flips the Frankfurt School, in a sense. Now, when he said this in the 1970s and 80s, it was outlandish. It was a little bit crazy. But if we look at the thinking around the Frankfurt School in the 1950s and 60s, and we look at people like the legacy of Said and Judith Butler, who famously said that the Hamas and Hezbollah should be understood as the progressive left in this sort of the struggle, the international struggle, and we look at the demonization not only of Israel and Zionism, but now more and more, as Professor Gopal expresses, the Jew as the white colonial settler. And I remember speaking to, we're going to send out a notice on Holocaust Memorial Day on the 27th of January. There's this incredible woman who speaks in our summer institute at Oxford, Mrs. Landau. And Mrs. Landau was from Poland. To make a long story short, her and her brother and father were in a forest, surviving in the forest on insects and starving. They get discovered by the Nazis. Their family is marched to a pit, and her family is executed. Her father pushes her in the pit. She survives the pit and eventually crawls out and is saved by a Polish Christian family and sort of nursed back to health. She ends up moving to Israel after the Holocaust of the Second World War, and got married and has children and now has grandchildren. And she's an amazing woman at so many levels. And she speaks for us. So here's a woman that's family was executed because they were poisoning the purity of the white Aryan nation. And she's alive today. And I remember sitting in Oxford telling her how we in the academy are perceived now as being white, as being apartheid, Zionist, fascist supporters. So here's a woman whose family was executed because they were not white. And now people like Professor Gopal and Edward Said, and sort of in this moment, in this philosophical intellectual moment, is portraying the Jew and Jewish intellectuals and Jewish students as white settlers. Incredible. Now, I've studied the work of, I was an urbanist for a while in my studies, Emmanuel Castell's urban sociology. And he writes very importantly that, culture is sort of the last vestige, that once we start engaging in struggles over culture, this indicates the breaking down of society, that the struggle should be on economic and political levels. Once we start fighting at the level of culture, this is problematic in all sorts of levels, which I won't get into now. So here again, the Jew is being defined by the other. Nobody in Nazi Germany was interested in how Jews define themselves. And tragically, more and more on university campuses, not just on the campus, but actually in the classroom, the Jew is being defined in an uncomplimentary way. It's not like Sorry, we exterminated you for not being white. Now maybe you should be welcome to the club and we're sorry. No. Now we are the quintessential white supremacist colonizers, Nazis. The victim of the Nazis is now the Nazi. And it's incredible. And this is rooted in very serious scholarship. This is not, Professor Gopal and Edward Said is not, this is not an aberration, but something that is very prevalent in scholarship. And this is where those of us who are concerned about understanding contemporary anti-Semitism at an intellectual level, at the level of ideas, which is so vital, have to grapple in this space. So, understanding anti-Semitism in a world of, in globalization, of neoliberalism, we're at a moment in societies where societies are fragmenting for all sorts of reasons. There's an international crisis of refugees. States are failing. States are falling apart. Societies fragmenting. In the United States, the extreme left and the extreme right seem to be rising and attacking the center. So understanding how anti-Semitism is arising out of these conditions and what is causing these conditions. Why is there a fragmentation? Why is there xenophobia? Why are societies collapsing? Why is there a refugee crisis? Why is racism and xenophobia in the West returning? Why is anti-Semitism returning? And we need to have, in a sense, a comprehensive assessment and framework to understand this, and it has to move away, in my view, from descriptive assessment. And then one of the projects we're doing, for example, at ISGAP is we're looking at the impact of soft power on education. So as the state, the state which emerged after the Second World War, there was an agreement among democratic nations that the state would provide basic services, unemployment insurance, healthcare, education, right? Housing, basic levels of housing, so that we would never get into a situation that, or create conditions which saw the rise of fascism in Europe, that so many people were displaced and marginalized economic, socially, and politically, that this was the conditions that were ripe for the emergence of fascism and even Stalinism. And the Western world got together, we created the United Nations, and we said there will always be a safety net. This would never happen again. But now, as the state is removing itself from supporting healthcare and education, as universities become more entrepreneurial, and they can't depend on the state to providing the resources, but universities are going out to get funding from foundations and countries and the like. What we're doing in one of our projects is looking at how the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, is using its soft power to provide billions of dollars that we know of to American universities. And what are the implications on policy, on education policy? What is if anti-Semites and sexist and homophobics are giving billions of dollars to a university, does this have an impact on education and education policy? I would submit to you that it does. So this is just one example of an interdisciplinary analysis that takes into consideration power and emerging differences in society and economic, social, and cultural processes on education policy, right? And this should be perceived as core to a research center doing work on contemporary anti-Semitism. Many people have said, no, this is security studies, or this is the work for the CIA or FBI or whatever it is. But if anti-Semites are having an impact on education at our best universities, and if these ideas of the demonization of who Jews are as a people, and Israel and Zionism is being supported by these funds, then what are the implications for a university education that should be a space where anti-Semites and racists and fascists don't interfere with the curriculum? So what is happening, and what are the implications for this? So these are some of the issues that we're studying and grappling with at ISGAP. So I'm going to leave it here. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A, but I just wanted to sort of throw out some of the challenges we have in trying to create a comprehensive critical framework of understanding anti-Semitism and power dynamics, so that the study of anti-Semitism can also learn and gain from the study of race and racism and sexism and gender inequality and queer studies and homophobia, and to place anti-Semitism in this sort of similar space and open it up to sort of a critical interdisciplinary assessment or analysis. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions or comments. I guess if you can put up your hand electronically, and I'll try and look at the photos.
Like, Barbara, did you have a question?
I do, and my question is about indigeneity, and I've noticed that there's people are beginning to talk more and more about Jewish indigeneity, and whether this is going to be addressed as part of the studies.
So the Jewish people as indigenous to Israel?
To Israel. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so yeah, that's an interesting argument, or I think it's being used more and more, I guess, by advocacy organizations, Jewish advocacy organizations,
But also academic.
Yeah, to an extent, yeah. Look, I think it's an important notion. I think Jewish understandings of, or sort of Jewish perceptions or constructions of identity is important to put out there and to be part of the conversation, part of the debate. As a footnote, I have a very close friend he's a chief of the Innu people, and he's a powerful chief. He was the head of the Assembly of First Nations. And I took him and his children and some other chiefs to Israel. It was informal, to hang out. They stayed on my floor, on my sofa. And yeah, we spoke, and they understood the Jewish connection to Israel and to the land as being very much indigenous. And I won't go into it, but if you look at all the holidays and how, I'm in Jerusalem now, actually, and how the holidays, it's like a timer. It's like each holiday is connected to the land, and from the spring holidays to the autumn holidays to harvest holidays, it's incredible. It's like a light switch. Things just are connected. So yeah, it's important. It's important. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
Yeah, no, I think so. Yeah, thank you.
And actually, yeah, I was very active in the kind of an anti-apartheid movement. I worked with the ANC, and I worked with people in the Black consciousness movement, and I unabashedly think that Zionism is a very powerful model for those who want to liberate Africa from colonial, economic and political colonialism and intellectual colonialism. That the Jewish people connecting Jewish ideas to a lot of these issues. Jewish notions of identity, Jewish notions of justice should also be part of the conversation, and it's very powerful. So I've dealt with these issues, and there are people concerned about the liberation of Africa, or parts of Africa, who do see Israel as a very powerful light. So I think in Western academia, it's being portrayed, in some circles in a very reactionary, negative light. But I know I've spent time in different African countries, and there's a very strong connection to Israel culturally and politically, and many people see Israel as a light of liberation from colonialism, and it's connected to indigenous notions of ideas and of peoplehood and belonging, and yeah, and I think Jewish identity actually kind of blows up Western construction of identity, of race, of ethnicity, of nation. Anyways, there's fertile ideas to discuss here. Christine, I see you, and then Holly, and then Michael.
Yes. Hi. Well, I every time I hear you talk, you always manage to help clarify aspects of contemporary anti-Semitism for me. So I'm really grateful for how you've spoken today. I just have a comment about something I saw online today, and it was a reference to, quote, dark academia as trending enormously in social media today. But when you want to know what is meant by that, according to, this is trending to, you know, sort of over 1 million people are sort of storming the gates to look at this. Oh, sorry, I meant to put up a little paragraph so you can understand what's that supposed to mean today for people who understand that term. Hang on a minute. There we go. So it's what happened was Instagram put out, you know, it follows trends, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, dark academia is a big deal. But what does it mean in that context? And here, as you can see, it's sort of talking about a subculture with emphasis on learning and writing and European literature and so on and so forth. And it's supposed to have two sides. They were classics of both canon literature, history of art, and a series of works on pop culture. But quite frankly, there's absolutely no mention of what we would think of as dark academia. And the only reason I'm putting this up is because I think it presents an opportunity to sort of engage, or at least to write a rather pithy piece, if you like, about what another side of what dark academia to us means, right? Because this is a whole group, I mean, 1 million people potentially, who certainly don't even potentially know about this. So I'm just putting it up for that reason. I welcome any comments.
All right. Thank you. I don't know so much about dark academia, and I don't even have a Twitter account, so you'll have to forgive me.
Well, but I mean, we wouldn't, I mean, that term just resonated with me, but not for any of the reasons that's up there right now, as to why it's trending, right? So I said, I think getting the message out and looking for really how to position this to people who don't know about, who don't think that way, don't have a sense, have not seen and not following. I just think it's important to try to pull, you know, to engage with people. I mean, dark academia is a real deal today, but it doesn't mean anything like what we're talking about or what we're researching on.
Well, you know, just to I didn't kind of complete the circle, and you've just reminded me. So when Edward Said says he's the last remaining Jew, it's interesting. I mean, this is this is sort of a religious Christian anti-Semitic trope. So this whole replacement theory. So in a sense, what Said's doing in the sort of progressive, post-colonial, postmodern moment, he's kind of recycling a very, very powerful idea that is deeply rooted in Western thought and in Western civilization, right? So I think if we start to understand anti-Semitism like we do racism or sexism as being structured into society, into our language, into our cities, into our economies, our political culture, etc., into our culture, into our religion, into our science. If we took that kind of comprehensive approach, Said's comments could not only be dismissed as being, you know, kind of outlandish as they were, but
Yeah.
he is tapping into something that is very much alive and well in the sort of Western traditions.
So this
anyway.
is in a sense what
Okay,
that.
but we have like 10 more minutes, so Holly has been patient. Sorry, Christine.
You're fine. I was going to say, so dark academia, just side note, is an aesthetic movement like cottagecore. So Spotify has like a dark academia atmospheric playlist and all of that. But I like your connection to this kind of bit of internet pop culture to what we're really talking about. Charles, my question for you has to do, it's kind of an American focused question, but something you said about education in the state really stuck with me. For those of you I don't know, I'm in Tennessee, in Nashville, and we're one of the states in America where CRT or critical race theory has been banned in K through 12 education by movements of the legislature. Now, what I find interesting about this is that not only the discussion of critical race theory as it pertains to more traditional, I'll put it that way, views of racism, it also is pertaining to discussions of anti-Semitism. We have different cases in the past couple years, since 2019 really, where our previous Holocaust discussion standards, which are pretty normal for middle school age children, 6th through 7th grade or starting at age 11 or 12, have been stripped. And along with commentary that if a teacher teaches about the Holocaust, they must also teach equally about an opposing viewpoint. My favorite is a Memphis federal judge who posted on Facebook, Jews need to get the F over the Holocaust. So I find we're in an interesting liminal space, if you will, where on one hand, we have this fight against Zionism, this fight against Jewish people, this really rampant anti-Semitism on the left, but then we also have it on the right. And then we have a mix of where the right puts anti-Semitism with the left and the left wing doesn't want the right. So can you address what might be going on here other than, you know, the same thing we've always seen as far as goes anti-Semitism generally? The Jews are still being othered, but how would you view the CRT, I guess, subsuming the Jewish struggle and anti-Semitism as well?
Yes, it's a great question. So, how do you understand, I guess, the emergence of radical social movements, I would call them social movements, on the left and on the right, and political Islam as well, thrown into the mix. And then sort of this intellectual moment where the Jew is being constructed or defined in a very specific way. Intersectionality. We have a whole seminar series on the issues of contemporary intersectionality and the Jew. So I think to understand this, we can do a whole seminar on this. But to understand why there's fragmentation in society, why, what is happening in the United States? Why is it happening? What is happening internationally? And why is it happening? And I think that these are some of the questions that need to be understood from an interdisciplinary, comprehensive framework to really get a sense of, why is this fragmentation happening and why is the Jew in some of these social movements, not all of them, but certainly in political Islam on the extreme left and on the extreme right, the perception of the Jew or the construction of the Jew is pretty central to or core to the ideologies of these social movements. So why? What's the historical legacy? Why is this emerging today? And I think to kind of have a comprehensive analysis of economic, social, and cultural processes in this moment of neoliberal globalization, I think could shed light on why these issues of anti-Semitism are emerging. And to be less descriptive, but more analytical. Quantitative and qualitative research together. Thank you, Holly. Nice to see you. Michael.
Hello, thank you. I very much enjoyed your presentation. I'm going to make an observation, which is not unique. I mean, and then ask for comment. You mentioned all the different studies on campus that developed over the last 50 years, ethnic, gender, feminists, and these groups seem to be advocates for their identity organization or identity groups. And I want just maybe you could make a comment on the fact that there are Jewish studies departments that themselves do not see, they see themselves as academics, investigating, as you kind of referred to, the history of the Jews in some places, which would be a history of anti-Semitism, but they don't feel like they want to engage in the current battlefield over anti-Semitism. Do you get my drift? And there's a difference to the point that Jewish studies have actually been, in many instances, different campuses have been infiltrated with a sort of intersectional view of Jews themselves as being on the oppressor side of things. Anyways, right. I'll let you comment.
Yeah, that's an important question and observation. So I don't know if I have the definitive response, but I'll try. I think, you know, some of the scholarship, or a lot of the scholarship on issues of racism, sexism, homophobia are solid, scientific, dispassionate research, and it should be understood as such. Some of the work dealing with racism and sexism, I think some of the good scholarship on trying to critique, I guess, dominant problematics when it comes to race and gendered identities, has some advocacy in it, for sure. But I think it's the good scholarship is based on solid scientific analysis, I would say. Yeah, and I think that, you know, in a sense, that's what we're trying to do at ISGAP. We're not trying to be advocates as such, although any form of hatred ought to be condemned unequivocally. So we're opposed to, you know, Jew hatred and racism and sexism and homophobia, and xenophobia. And what's interesting about anti-Semitism is a lot of these other forms of hatreds and demonization of people, of humans, is connected to issues of anti-Semitism. And some of our scholars make these connections in a profound way. So there is a connection. But then I think, having said that, yeah, I think in this sort of politically correct moment where Jews are being increasingly perceived as apartheid supporting colonial fascists and Jews as the quintessential white racist, yeah, you have some Jewish intellectuals and scholars and students, I think, are under a lot of pressure to be quiet or to remain silent or to try to be politically, you know, pass, if you will, and to lay their heads low and just get by. You know, increasingly, the environments that faculty and students are working on or living under in universities in the United States, in Canada and Europe, is more and more difficult. So, you know, these are all, so people cope with this in all sorts of ways.
It's 13 hours.
And I hope, in a sense, that, you know, the intellectual work that we're doing could empower people to understand what's going on in universities, to empower students, that they understand who the Students for Justice in Palestine are and how they're getting funded. And for faculty and administrators to understand that if you're taking money from people who call for, you know, the liquidation of Jews, imagine in 2022, universities are taking funds, a lot of funds, from organizations and advocates of people who call for the liquidation, the extermination of Jews. The head of the Qatari Foundation, Yosef Kawadawi, literally, I'm quoting him, repeatedly throughout his life has been arguing that the true Muslim is obligated to complete the work of Hitler. Imagine. And universities, some of our finest universities, are taking money from people with that perspective. Now, if, you know, thank goodness, if, you know, if a racist fascist in the United States who was connected to the KKK publicly gave money to a university, I would hope in 2022 there'd be an outrage and that it would not pass because of an awareness on issues of race and racism.
May I say a word before we go? I'm Joel Sheridan.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah,
Yes.
you cut me off at the right time. I was about to go on a whole tirade.
Yes,
Okay.
I know, and you just got a few minutes.
All right.
The thing is, my book, Anti-Semitism and the 1753 Jew law controversy, was just published this January, and
Yeah,
it's
Mazel
in fact,
tov.
and it, yes,
Happy to see it published.
right. It's a study of anti-Semitism in the raw, and it shows that it's the first prime example where anti-Semitism was used as a trigger to attempt to overthrow a legitimate democratic government. And it shows in effect as well from wider study in the book that one of the major consistent issues that come through the years is this question of unconditional right of residence of Jews. Jews basically, in the eyes of the anti-Semite, do not have unconditional right of residence. So they have been expelled from countries all over the years. In 1290 from England, 1492 we know about, and from Germany basically, and it's either done by an expulsion or in effect if the hostile community in which they live decides that they cannot tolerate the Jews any longer, will go. Well, my point is that in all the arguments which come forward, I don't see the sufficient emphasis being placed on the fact that it's the hidden agendas of anti-Semitism, which is even more dangerous to society. Now, I'm not talking more dangerous to Jewish society, but to society as a whole, is the hidden agenda of the anti-Semite. In many cases, he doesn't even care about the Jews, but he uses the Jews in order to promote his other agenda, which, like Hitler, is a prime example of that one.
Yeah,
and
so, yeah,
I don't understand why. I don't understand why this point is not made.
So first of all, Mazel tov on your book. You persevered. I know you worked on it for many years, so congratulations. And we'll circulate it with ISGAP and send everybody an icon they can click on to see your book. So Mazel tov. And yes, you're right. I think when you were speaking, I was reminded by the words of Elie Wiesel. And he said several things that were of profound importance. He was the first honorary president of ISGAP, and I had the privilege of knowing him since I was a child. And he always said that anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ends with Jews, that once this form of hatred is unleashed on society, it does not know any bounds. And he also said that anti-Semitism begins with words and ideas, and that the Shoah didn't begin with the crematoriums and the railroad tracks. It began with words and ideas. And it was the words and ideas of the protocols of the Elders of Zion that lay the foundation for the catastrophe of Europe, as well as European Jewry. And it is this vile form of hatred that forms the basis of political Islam and the sort of acquiescence to it by progressive postmodern intellectuals in this moment in time. So it's very dangerous. These ideas
if I may add,
we're over time. Yes, you may.
I know, I just want to say that anti-Zionism basically is based upon the question of not giving permanent residence to Jews anywhere. It's the same thing. The UN made a mistake in their eyes in 1948 by giving permanence to the Jews in a particular place. The homeless Jew is acceptable, but a permanent resident Jew is not. And history, well, I won't take up more of your time.
We're going to have to end it because we're out of time. But before we go, I wonder, El Shaddai or Chloe, so, we do all these seminars that many of you are aware of. So please feel free to join. You can see our seminar series schedule on our website at isgap.org. And I hope you'll return for the ISGAP-Woolf seminar series. We have amazing scholars speaking in the series. It's really an honor for all of us to be able to bring this series to you. And Miriam and the Woolf Center, thank you for this. Okay, so I think we ended here, and hopefully you'll come back to the next seminar.
Thank you, everyone.
for
We'll be
joining
back
and
in a.
stay well. Oh, go ahead, Ira.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Thank you. Ira, go ahead. You were going to say something.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. We'll be back here in 2 weeks' time. The same starting time at 12 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. London time on Monday, February 7th for Dr. David Hirsch. So please join us then.
And David, as many of you know, is a prominent British sociologist that's been doing a lot of work on contemporary anti-Semitism in the UK. So he's always he always gives a good lecture. So I hope you'll join us. Stay safe.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.